Okay, well, let's get started. This is a subject that even though our center has borne the name in some people's mind of a school for prophets, I've never actually given a major series of talks just on the prophets. I did back in Cincinnati, but never, strangely enough, out here. In some ways, we assumed it in our structures that this is what we were doing, and that's why some people picked up that idea that we were going to be a school to affirm, educate this charism of prophecy. And it is interesting to me that I'm going to read here from Ephesians, for example, although he says the same in Corinthians. Paul lists the prophet as the second most important of the gifts of the Spirit. And yet I think it's safe to say that most of us grew up thinking that was something that existed in the past, but it had no contemporary significance or meaning. And you really didn't expect to meet any prophets. If you did, you thought they'd be eccentric or fanatic or strange. But he says, if Paul wrote Ephesians, certainly the school of Paul, where's the passage? 4. To some his gift was that they should be apostles, to some prophets, to some evangelists, to some pastors and teachers, so that the holy ones together make a unity in the work of service. A unity in the work of service, building up the body of Christ. In Corinthians, he specifically says it's the second most important gift. So here we have this phenomenon of something that's supposedly very important, and most of us know nothing about it. Has something gone wrong, or was he wrong? I almost picture a big picture puzzle, and there's a piece missing. And I think it's the importance of the meaning of prophecy. And first of all, let's try to empty our minds as best you can. Let's just assume, I don't know what you all understand, but let's assume it doesn't mean anything you think a prophet means. Someone who foretells the future, or someone who issues dire warnings to people. So let's get rid of that. Also, traveling around the world, I've often said that I've ran into many churches named Christ the King. I've seen in Christian art Christ dressed as a priest on the cross in priest vestments. But I have never in all the world found a church named Christ the Prophet. And hardly ever, if ever, except in very much in the last few years, have I ever seen Christ the Prophet pictured in art. I think it almost reveals there's just a great big non-understanding there, non-appreciation, even non-expectation. We don't expect it, and so if you don't expect it, if you don't want it, if you're not looking for it, well, you sure aren't going to get it. And when I think of, seminaries were training places for those of us who were supposed to be teachers and apostles in the church, we literally trained the other gifts of the Spirit. We educated them, we affirmed them, certified them, ordained them. But in fact, if anyone would dare to think of himself or herself as a prophet, you probably wouldn't even be welcome in the church. You'd be assumed to be dangerous or critical or negative or crazy, probably. All I can presume is that there's some kind of ideological bias here. And I'm going to try to get at that tonight, if we can. What is it that we can't see this, or look for it, or expect it? I think those who establish religion and those who build churches have an inherent bias against the charism of prophet. I hope the word charism isn't too new to most of you. It's simply a translation of the word that Paul uses for gift. charis, and it means a free gift. But a whole theology of charisms developed in the church. If you have a charism, it has little to do with your natural talent, education, or formation. You just have it. And that's why it's a free gift. I've often wondered how I can talk, why I talk this way, and where does it come from? After 33 years, I still don't know. I guess that's what they mean. It's something that you really would be foolish to be proud of personally. You just want to thank somebody for it because you know you didn't work for it, develop it, and you're not worthy of it. It is given. So the best the tradition could do, and you'll see this in some Christian art, is see the prophets as those who foretold the Messiah. You've all heard that in every biblical movie you've ever seen. I don't think that's true. I think Jesus came along and represented the very best of Judaism. So from hindsight, do you understand? And the New Testament writers worked that way too. It looks like they were all foretelling the coming of this guy. He just fulfills the best and the deepest of Judaism. And so it looks like they're foretelling him. He just lives up to what they're heading toward, what they look forward to, what they're creating. In other words, Jesus is a consummate Jew. He's Judaism at its best and at its fullest. And I think we Christians have been at a real disadvantage that no one ever told us that. That by and large, Jesus saw himself up to the point of his death as one who is reforming his own religion. Not leaving it, not founding a new religion, but reforming Judaism. That reform took off with such force that within a generation, that's what Peter and Paul are already fighting about, it becomes a sect of its own, and eventually what we would think of as a religion of its own that we call Christianity. But I don't believe we're ever going to understand the prophets or the charism of prophecy if we try to see it as people who foretell messiahs. You know, that just doesn't get it, doesn't even get close to it. It misses the historical meaning of the prophets in the social life of Israel. As long as prophets are just foretellers of what became our religion, for those of us who are Christian, we have almost totally missed their clarifying, their purifying function that they have, that they served in Israel, and I'd like to say that they must serve in all religion. Joseph Campbell said, among many of the wise things he said, there were a few things that I didn't agree with. He said that all religions at the higher levels are saying the same thing. I don't think that's true. I think they're very different lenses on the great mystery. There's one great mystery, but I don't think we're all saying the same thing. But one area where that's surely true is the area of the Hebrew prophets. They are really in a category all their own. You don't find in the sacred scriptures of any of the other world religions major texts, a major part of the Hebrew scriptures, which are largely critical of that religion. And for those texts to be included as canonical sacred texts, when those texts are always telling the Jewish people, you're hypocrites, you're phonies, you do not have faith, you're unfaithful to God, is really quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary. And I think you see the effects of it. I hope you've all had some good Jewish friends. When Judaism is healthy, it's real healthy. And you'll see that capacity for self-criticism. I wish Christianity had it as healthily as Judaism has it. Now, I don't see it in Israel today, to be perfectly honest. And I've said that to some of my same Jewish friends. I don't think Zionism, what's happening in Israel today, is at all faithful to their own Jewish prophets, completely ignoring what they taught them, just as we have almost completely ignored the Jewish prophets. But let's try, for beginners, to simply see prophecy as the emergence, way ahead of time, and in a faith context, the emergence of self-critical thinking. And you've got to know how extraordinary that is when you see how incapable of it we are 3,000 years later. I mean, that these folks called prophets could be free to love something and to criticize it at the same time. Now that's the art form, and that's what's still very rare. To be able to love something, be committed to it as they were to Israel, and yet be lambasting it, you know. I mean, even today, one of the most common criticisms I get from other priests is, you criticize the church, which is so amazing to me, because I don't think that's a criticism, to say that you criticize the church, because you're being faithful to Jesus and the prophets. That's exactly what they did. But most people, anything you criticize, the assumption in the dualistic mind is, if you criticize it, you don't like it, you don't love it, or you're not a company man, or you're not a loyalist. That again shows we have not been formed by the prophets. That we almost can't imagine you could be critical of something and love it at the same time. Shows a real deficit in spiritual awareness, it seems to me. And what our expectation is. We want company men or women. We want loyalists. We don't want prophets. We don't want people who point out our shadow side or our dark side. And of course there is such a thing as negative criticism and positive criticism. And I think you can feel the difference on the level of energy. Although when you just read the spare, naked texts of the prophets, boy, some of them sound negative, as does Jesus too. But our assumption would be, and we see it in other parts of their lives and other parts of their writings, that this criticism is coming from a primary positive encounter. And the positive has preeminence. The positive energy is what is the overriding experience. I believe that the biblical tradition is saying that whenever the prophetic function is lacking in any religion, that religion will always be self-serving and idolatrous. And I would say that's true. When the prophets are kicked out of any group, it's a very short time before that group is largely into self-maintenance, self-protection, self-promotion, self. That's the natural movement of any institution. It moves toward its own self-perpetuation. I look sometimes even at our religious communities, and I look at the amount of time and money and energy we spend to have meetings, to hold ourselves together, and to continue ourselves. And you sometimes say, my gosh, what are we doing for the world? We just want to continue the Franciscans. But every group does that. You put a large amount of your time and energy into maintaining yourself. I hope we can avoid that mistake at CAC. But without the prophetic function, we won't. We'll do the same thing, that we exist for our own existence. That's all. That's where everything goes. Walter Brueggemann, I'll be quoting him a lot these days, is probably my favorite and most admired biblical scholar. He says, and I think this shows pure genius, that the three segments of the Hebrew Bible, which is what we now call it, or better call it than the Old Testament, because it isn't old, all right? It's the Hebrew Scriptures, and it is still applicable and appropriate. He says there are three major segments, which is what I was trained into. There's the 5 books of Moses, what we call the Torah. There's the prophetic books, and there's the wisdom literature. Those three segments. But what he sees with his usual genius is that these three sections of the Hebrew Scriptures represent the ordinary and healthy development of human consciousness. And normally, if a person is growing up in a healthy time, a healthy culture, a healthy family, what comes first is structure. What comes first is identity and boundaries and knowing who you are. And being told that's good. I've said to many groups, I grew up in Kansas, as many of you know, and I grew up with a wonderful set of illusions, but it was a nice place to start. It just wasn't a good place to continue. I mean, I still love Kansas, I guess, but it's not necessarily a place to continue or certainly not to end. I grew up being told, as I'll bet most of you were, even if you didn't grow up in Kansas, that America was the best country. And then, being Catholic, we were also told that our religion was the best religion. Isn't that nice? In fact, all the others were just heretics. We were the only real ones who had the true Christian religion. Then I started, visiting Christians from other denominations, and they all have another version of the same illusion, But I want you to see, this is all archetypal. That's exactly what Israel did. Israel is an archetype of what every religion is going to do. They thought they were the chosen people, and that meant no one else was. Huh? We used to speak of non-Catholics. Do you still use that term? Non-Catholics. And they spoke of Gentiles, or which meant non-Jews. There's us and there's everybody else. So you have to start, though, and I want to say that strongly. You have to start with Torah. I think, not to hurt anybody's feelings, but I think most child rearing in the last 30 years has been disastrous. Because people, the baby boomers, my generation, thought that you could raise kids without identity, structure, and boundaries, And these kids are just now begging for it from every side. It was a terribly failed experiment in child rearing. Thinking, they'll discover it for themselves, and they'll find it for themselves. And so we abdicated all eldering, all mentoring, all authority, all wisdom, and now we're paying the price for it. Well, Israel didn't do that. It started with Torah. Leviticus and Numbers aren't real exciting books, so don't use them you could use them to go to sleep with, I guess. But not for inspiration. But it's what you got to do to circle the wagons. Picture it as ego boundaries. This is who we are. This is what's good about being who we are. You've got to have some ground to stand on. You've got to know you're beloved and chosen. You've got to. Every good psychologist would say that. They're representing it on a social, historical level. Then the second set of books are the prophets. And that represents the birth, which we see a little hint of at the age of 2, apparently, the terrible 2s. And then we see it full-blown in the teenage years. The emergence of criticism. The emergence of oppositional, negative thinking. When the kids fight you on everything and oppose you on everything, apparently this is also necessary to grow up. You've got to go through this stage too. When you don't allow prophetic thinking, the Catholic Church didn't allow any dissent for 400 years after the Reformation. It pulled us into a very tight and clear identity. But then when the floodgates opened in the 60s, there was no stopping it. Because when no dissent is allowed, then when it does bubble up, it bubbles over and takes over. So you do well to allow the prophetic function, the second stage. But what Brueggemann says is, if you move sequentially, in terms of human consciousness, personal development, you will come to the third stage, which is wisdom. Probably most represented in books like the Book of Job, Ecclesiastes, many of the Psalms, where you have this ability to live with mystery and paradox, where you have this mystery to move around inside of. where you don't have to have black and whites anymore. You've moved from Leviticus and Numbers, which is all black and white, all absolutes. I was just speaking in Nova Scotia last week, and a whole group of college students took off school to attend this workshop I was giving. And the older people, who were most of the folks there, 200 some, were so impressed that these young college students were coming to hear me. And they gave them the front seat, so I had these young people in the front. And they were listening and taking notes on everything. But then the final day, I let many of them just approach the microphone and give me feedback and ask questions. And they just kept saying, why has no one told us any of this? Huh? Why did no one tell us the glories of our tradition? Huh? We just feel like the most lost, bereft generation of Catholic Christians. That all we were given was fluff, sort of, easy aphorisms about God loves you, which you really don't believe because you really haven't longed and thirsted for it. You've paid no price for it. You see, you almost have to have the law, and you have to break the law before you can appreciate grace. You know that? When you come and announce grace to people before they've sinned, failed, struggled, lost, it goes right over their head. Oh, that's nice. God is love. So you have this little chummy Jesus, you don't have any deep, intimate relationship going on there because it's nothing you ever suffered for, waited for, longed for. You had no guilt to overcome. You were told right away, there's nothing to be guilty for. God loves you unconditionally. You've got to long for unconditional love. In other words, you probably got to hate yourself for a while. You got to make some mistakes before you can appreciate unconditional love. So you got to have the structure. Paul talks about this beautifully. You got to have the law. He says the law was given so that you would break the law, and so that you would know that you can't obey the law. And that struggle inside of it is the birth of consciousness. The consciousness emerges in struggling with the shadow. I'm convinced of that. You remain largely unconscious as a human being. Largely unconscious. Till some issue comes into your life that doesn't make sense. Where you're not right, it's not right, life's not right, God's not right, the world's not right. And in that struggle with the shadow, with failure, with the tragic, with the wound, call it what you want. That's normally when people emerge from the unconscious state to the conscious state. Now that's why goody two-shoes kind of people who just remain in stage one, inside the law, Torah, you follow me? Huh? Just do everything perfectly, never miss Mass. I love being Catholic, I love being American, I love being male. Oh, I didn't. List for you. My third illusion, we were also told that males were better than females. This was a lovely way to start life. It really was. Best country, best gender, and best religion, Didn't have anything to do with truth, And so the 60s had to come. I was lucky enough to be born in the old church. I was raised, as many of you were, very conservative, very traditional. But then was in college and theology in the 60s. And fortunately, the Franciscans were giving me this marvelous theology. So we knew how to process it. And the lens just kept widening and widening and widening. And came to what I hope is wisdom, the third stage. So remember that. Torah, prophets, wisdom. That's the sequence. It's a very simple paradigm. But I want to point out, most secular, humanist, liberal Americans don't believe that. They have pretty much entirely thrown out Torah. There's no law, there's no structure, there's no boundaries, there's no expectation of something you got to butt up against, struggle with, and fight with. It's just, open space from the beginning. So really, there's no room for the prophet. Do you understand? Because there's nothing to rebel against. There's nothing to criticize, except everything, actually. You end up rather negative and cynical. And certainly you don't come to wisdom. So what I'm saying, brothers and sisters, I believe Jewish religion is archetypal religion. because it illustrates the very pattern of maturity, immaturity, advance, regression, best, worst, that characterizes all cultures and all religions. I look at Catholicism so often, and it's a mirror image of Judaism. It's done almost the exact same things. But as long as we got ourselves off the hook and said the only reason we had the Old Testament, and the Word gave it away, was to prepare for us, then when we read these prophetic passages, what we think these prophets are doing is, well, they're criticizing those people. But it doesn't apply to us because now we're Christianity. We've reformed Judaism. Do you see? What a clever bit of smoke and mirrors, you know? It basically emasculates, if that's an appropriate word, the whole power of the Scriptures, castrates them. And I know for a fact, after living in the church many years, that's the way the typical group of religious, priests, bishops, and laity interpret the Scriptures. When Jesus, for example, is criticizing the Pharisees, well, they deserve that because they were Jewish legalists. They were Jewish ritualists. But that doesn't apply to Catholicism. We're not that way. I mean, do you see? It's powerless. It's basic. You might as well stop reading the Word of God because it all just was applying to those people who had it wrong, but now we have it right because the Messiah has come and we're all following the Messiah, so-called. But once you see Judaism as archetypal religion, that the patterns there of ego and transformation and regression are universal patterns, it becomes very clear. Very clear. This is the pattern of every denomination I know. I'm going to pick on Catholics the most because I have to. You got to pick on your own the most. But I know some of you are from other traditions, and you know, maybe it's on a smaller scale, but it's true of every group that emerges. It soon is in to self-maintenance, self-perpetuation, self-congratulation, and incapable of self-criticism on any really prophetic level. And that's where the word came from. So the corruption of the best is always the worst. And I'm going to say Judaism is the best, and Judaism to this day is the worst. And both are true, and both don't cancel one another out. They can both coexist. Catholicism is marvelous. It creates larger than life human beings. It's really quite extraordinary. But it creates masses of people who are living at an almost totally unconscious level. Both are true. The greater light you have, the greater shadow you cast. And that's true of individuals. That's true of groups, nations. Look at our own country. I think we'd say the same for the United States. There's so much that's extraordinary about this country. But every time I leave its shores, just as I did last week, just crossing over into Canada, it's amazing the things I could say about the President of the United States in Canada and get nods from the whole room. Whereas just cross over on this side and you just get, stares. Now what is that? Why is it on this side we can't talk about George Bush and just a few miles up the road we can? That's the power of group narcissism, right? And the need that groups have to protect themselves and to deny their own shadow. You cannot critique your own system, but the prophets did. So we Christians have grown up with an almost constant pattern of interpreting Jesus as one who criticized the Jewish religion, the high priests, the scribes, the lawyers, the Pharisees, the temple police, Jewish legalism, Jewish ritualism, debt codes, purity codes. How silly and superstitious those Jews were. How mistaken they were. I'm so glad we're not that way, How hard-hearted and ignorant they were. And we, some countries even called them the Christ killers. Talk about projecting your shadow elsewhere so you don't have to own your shadow yourself. clearly the image of being the Christ killer is every man, every woman. It's what we all are doing to God. And to apply that to one race or one nation is to almost totally miss the point. I don't know how else to say it. If we do not see Jesus and the prophets speaking to every age, universal themes of illusion, or universal capacity for self-serving religion, I have found I believe we have found a most clever way to honor the prophets into insignificance. They're really harmless. You know, it's interesting to me now, I know a lot of the prophets' names aren't real attractive, Obadiah and Zechariah, but the only people I know who've ever, in the Christian world, who've ever named their children after the prophets were the black people. We white folks wouldn't think of naming our kids after these guys, because basically we don't relate to them, we don't understand them, they're not a part of our worldview. It's very interesting to me that they were a part of the black people's worldview. And I think you can put two and two together already. When you're at the bottom, when you're enslaved, the prophets make sense. When you're comfortable and you're enjoying the fruits of the system, the prophets don't make a bit of sense. In fact, they're a threat. For us, the prophets' names, if we know them at all, we probably know Isaiah, which is the most quoted by Jesus. But most of them are read in church and then forgotten. It is for this reason, I believe, that here at the CAC, we've taken up the task of educating and calling forth this charism of prophecy. By definition, the prophet has to be at the edge of institutional religion. And I want to say, as we know, those of us who've worked here, it's a hard position to hold. To be on the edge of the inside, but still be inside. And inside positively. You basically make very few friends, I want to tell you. Because those inside are convinced that you're outsiders, as even some bishops are, and those outside think you're far too Christian or Catholic. You basically please nobody. So unless you're ready to walk that narrow path of pleasing nobody, maybe that's what Jesus meant when he said the whole world will hate you. The prophetic position is on the edge of the inside. And you have to hold it structurally, you have to hold it personally. And I don't think you can do it without wisdom and grace to know how to do both. Because there's many times it would be easier to leave, and there's many times it would be easier to just play the company man and just go along with the game. A few years ago, Jim Wallace of Sojourners and several of us who had founded the Community of Communities back in the 70s, we were talking over some beers in Washington, D.C. one evening, and we all had this wonderful dream of founding what we called, probably presumptuously, an underground seminary. And we were all from different denominations. I think I was the only Catholic there. But it was amazing. We all had this same idea, that we knew once they got in the regular institutional seminary, they could not structurally be prophets anymore, with the best of intentions, with the best of goodwill. And I'm not blaming anybody. It's what we mean by structural sin, by structural illusion. It's not anybody's fault. Let's say Stephen, who's the director here of the CAC. If you dropped in, as some of you did today, to visit the CAC, and you went to the director's office, and you said, well, tell me about the new CAC. And what if he would have spent 15 minutes just bad-mouthing me and all the rest of us, telling you, and there's plenty to tell, about Richard's faults and how the CAC hasn't done this right and made this or that. Well, I mean, you would go out just reeling with, well, why am I here? And why did I donate to this group? And why did I join their internship? The boss himself just told me that it's a corrupt institution. See, when you're ever at the head of something, there's a whole plate that goes with it. You've got to talk, and I'm meaning to be a responsible person. You've got to talk credibly, intelligently, calmly, and loyally about what's good, about what we're doing. You'd be foolish not to. And every one of you in this room would do the same thing. So don't try to blame anybody. It goes with the turf. You have to. You have to. That's why the prophets are never priests, right? In the Hebrew Scriptures. Ezekiel is, interestingly enough, which shows it can once in a while come together. But they're almost always people on the edge. Actually, Isaiah was an establishment person too, first Isaiah. But almost all the other rest of them, like Amos, says he's a dresser of sycamore trees. And he just begs, let me out of this job. I want to go back to my sycamore trees. Everybody hates me in this job. Most of them seem to be just ordinary people who find themselves with a gift. It's not a matter of foretelling, and I know this is playing with the English language, but it's what some have called forthtelling. Speaking with a forwardness of truth and direction and passion, that after the fact we say he foretold it. It's not that they're really, I don't think, predicting something. They have just immense spiritual insight. I read, for example, I can pick up Thomas Merton's books today in 2002. And it's like some of them, not in every case, but I'd say most of them, it's like he wrote them last year. How can one man be such a visionary, such a seer? My books will be dated after 10 years. He's been dead for 30 years, and he's still contemporary. That's what a seer can do. And by the way, the original Hebrew word for a prophet meant just that. One who sees, a seer, who sees all the way through. So the prophetic charism has not been honored, I believe. I don't think it's been recognized. It's not been called forth, frankly, because it really is a very narrow path that few are going to want to walk. And few are going to be even temperamentally ready for. It takes a certain kind of inner freedom. It takes a certain kind of ability to hold anxiety, to live with ambiguity. It takes a freedom that not to be loved by everybody or not to be liked by everybody. If you need to be liked too much, you'd never could speak prophetically. So that right there narrows down the playing field, doesn't it? How many of us are going to want that? Or how many of us temperamentally are going to be prepared for it? Very few do it at all. I'm going to say even less do it well. And maybe one reason for that is perhaps we've tended to see it as a life profession, like you have an official prophet title. The evidence is, as best I can read the lives of the prophets, very few of them were prophets their whole life. Many for just a certain period, where they had insight, where they had passion, where they had this foundational God experience. And we're going to talk a lot about that. That's what makes it foundationally positive and not negative. And this, it seems, is what held them there for the task at hand. But like Amos, they eventually went back to their sycamore trees. So it isn't like other jobs or roles or functions or titles that you have, a little shingle or badge that says, I am a prophet. Usually, and I bet you've seen that in your own life, it's maybe for one cause or one issue or one oppressed group that God gives you a special clarity, a special passion, where you have to speak it or you're going to die, you know? And I've never read that anywhere, but I want to say that here, because I'm convinced that's a key to opening up and picking up this charism of prophet. If we don't have to bear the burden of thinking of ourselves as that is what I am. I know sometimes I've been introduced that way on the road. I often am, and I don't like it because I don't know how to live up to that, and I don't know how to do it. There have been times where I've been used that way, but I sure don't want to wear that badge the rest of my life. And I don't see God asking it of the biblical prophets. So let me at least add that to the conversation. I think it's more likely for an issue, for a period, for an event, where one is often called to prophecy. And that seems to be true of most of the biblical prophets. It's not a lifetime job. The charism is also most rare because, for me, it demands two seemingly opposite things. And I would like and hope that the CAC has been calling forth those. We now have been around for 15 years. The two opposite things are radical traditionalism and shocking iconoclasm at the same time. Now, normally, wouldn't you think those two would cancel one another out? That's why most people don't even expect to see it. If they see one of those first, they'll presume you're that. Oh, he's still just a pious little Catholic boy, you know. Or he's an angry man, you know. And they cannot imagine that those two, if you'd really listen long enough, can coexist and tame one another and educate one another. That's what we see in the prophets. They are radical traditionalists. And don't doubt that for a moment. Don't in any way think of biblical prophets as our contemporary social activists, which is the most common mistake today. Because most, not all, but most your contemporary social activists are quite embarrassed to use the God word, or to use the prayer word, or to use the faith word, or the surrender word, or the trust word. To put together these immense opposites demands a level of human maturity, human groundedness, spiritual intelligence, readiness not to be liked, willingness to be persecuted by good people. Right? Now hold on to that. It's all easy to be persecuted by people that you don't have any regard for anyway. You're sort of glad. You know, well, if he doesn't like me, that's a compliment, you know. But what's hard, I know this is hard for me when I get some hate letters from people that I do like and respect for other reasons. Ooh, that hurts. Huh? Because you really have to suffer your self-doubt at that point. Huh? A willingness to be persecuted and disliked by good people. A willingness to somehow really believe, and this probably is the biggest act of faith of all, to really believe that God is calling you to do this, and God is using you, that you are an instrument. And have no doubt, the prophets had no doubt. That's one thing you're going to see again and again in the text. God told me to say this, and I must say it. Or as Jeremiah says, my bowels will break open. I have to say it. My heart is burning within me. I cannot exist if I don't say it. I believe the charism of prophecy is also rare because, and I'm going to do some comparisons with what it's not. This is often the only way we can learn, by comparing it over against something else. It is, in many people, confused with simply critical thinking instead of self-critical thinking. That if you're critical, you're a prophet. In fact, I would say it's been used that way pretty much for the last 20 years. Oh, he's very prophetic. She's very prophetic. Whether that critique is really coming from a positive God experience, from a God center, that the energy is positive and life-giving, even though it might be hard and difficult, you can tell the difference. Every one of you in this room, you know the difference between when someone is criticizing you from a positive space and from a negative space. You can feel it. It's on the energy level. When it's coming from love and when it's really just coming to put you down and to defeat you and to put your face in the mud. I think the charism is rare because it's also confused with simply oppositional personalities, passive-aggressives, anti-authority types, anti-institutional types, anti-government personalities. I mean, we've met them at many of our marches and protests over the years, where we'd be marching next to people who protest anything that the American government did. Do you understand? All it has to have is the name American on it, and they're against it. I'm sorry. I might even agree with you in the cause, but that's not prophecy. Huh? That's your personality. Probably your hatred of your father still working its way out. And deal with your father, and don't project your father onto Ronald Reagan. I said that literally to someone back in the 80s, I don't like Ronald Reagan either, but I'm not interested in working with that here. That's not what we're about, working out our father issues through heads of government. And, I mean, this might sound facetious, but I'm sorry, this is the norm. It's one reason I founded the center, because I felt that to be the norm. That again and again, my first 15 years in Cincinnati, where we did a lot of activism in the later years, you'd go to these planning meetings, and it was just 15 enlightened but untransformed egos sitting around the table, each wanting their own way, each taking offense, all word police, Talk about control freaks, Social activists are control freaks off the wall. And I said, there's got to be a better way to do social activism, than simply gathering together egos on the left. Leftist egos, which are supposedly okay egos because they're enlightened, because they're liberal and humanistic, so-called. So that's what got us thinking in this direction. That the prophetic charism has to come from a God place, not an angry place. It has to come from a good place, not a place of fear, not a need to humiliate anybody else or defeat anybody else. If you're still into defeating or humiliating or punishing other people, you're not there yet. And who of us is, I guess. The charism is often confused with loose cannon types. People, very often, to be honest, who can't work in teams, who can't be a part of any planning anything. They have very poor social skills because all they have is their own inner righteousness. They have an opinion and an answer on everything. And after a while, you don't want to work with them. So many good social causes in this country, brothers and sisters, have gotten nowhere simply because of the brutish, and I'm going to use that word, brutish character of so many social activists. That because they feel they've got an inner right, I've got the truth, I don't have to develop normal skills of politeness, of decency, of appreciation, of thank you, of pardon me, or whatever it might be. That the rest of us normally have to learn to work together and to not step on one another's toes. You almost sense sometimes a delight in stepping on other people's toes or offending other people. I used to think almost half of social activists were 8s on the Enneagram, And if you know the Enneagram, you know that particular type does. They get their energy by opposing. They do. We had an intern here not too long ago who you didn't feel you could say anything without her saying the exact opposite. The most simple thing. And she would have to point out the other side. And you just wished someone could get close enough to her to help her to see. I don't think she has enough self-knowledge to know that she's defeating everything by her negativity. And I'm sure sees that negativity as being intelligent, prophetic, and on the cutting edge. But she will never be able to form a team, a little small community. So how could she possibly create the big community that we call human society, or call forth the big community that we call human society? Sometimes the charism is confused with people who see themselves as saviors, liberators, messiahs, reformers, holier than thou, but on the left. And again, when it's on the left, ever since the 60s, it's okay. It's real amazing. The baby boomers, we all hate righteousness on the right. These conservative types, these rigid types, these racists and these narrow-minded individuals. But we almost don't have the eyes to see that same narrow-mindedness, that same orthodoxy can exist on the left. And there it's normally supposed to be acceptable. In short, prophecy since the 1960s has often become the righteousness and the ego concern and the orthodoxy of people who call themselves liberal, progressive, or enlightened. That's one reason, again, why it's even harder to now name the charism correctly. Thus, the CAC, after 15 years, has ended up more and more just training people, this is going to sound too easy, in just adult spirituality. I mean, I know when we started, those of you who came in the early internships, almost half of the program was social activism, either doing it or being taught about it, and half was on contemplation. Those of you who've made the internship in the last several years, it's 80 to 90% contemplation. All in the context of social activism, assuming we've got to do something to heal this world. But you really can't teach social activism. You just grow people up. Grow people up spiritually and humanly, all with the assumption that we've got a job to do out there. So I believe we need a school for prophets because we need faith-filled critical thinking. Faith-filled critical thinking. All of those words apply. Not negative criticism, but, and there is such a thing, positive criticism. It can only be done if one is grounded in a positive experience of being. Now, our word for that positive experience of being is God. We don't have to use that word. And all teachers of contemplation, no matter what tradition they're coming from, are trying to help you to find ways to collapse back into that being that you are in God, that we're all running from and have separated from. Most of us grew up thinking of God as a being instead of being itself. And if that helps you, it does help a lot of people in their meditation practice, where we're always trying to please a being or get a being who's supposedly out there on our side or to listen to us or to like us. That doesn't help much anymore. It gets us into manipulative religion. But if you can see God as being itself, and everything participates in that being, not a consciousness up there in heaven deciding if he or she wants to listen to me, but consciousness itself. And that's why contemplation is always teaching you how to limit the noise of the mind. Because as long as you identify your little tiny mind with consciousness, you'll never get there. You've got to stop it to collapse back into the great consciousness, the universal consciousness that all things participate in, that we religious people, we believers, call God. And I would be comfortable and prefer that word God. But we've got to know that more and more people don't use that word God. And we want to create community with them too. And we want to be brothers and sisters with them too. We don't have time anymore for prophets who just talk to their own in-house group, who have their own in-house orthodoxy language and can only talk to other Catholics or other white people or other Americans or other social activists. So language, we're going to see, is very important to the prophets. And what they move toward is poetry, beautiful language. Now, we don't appreciate it because we read them, of course, in translation. But some of the translations are still very good. Much and the most effective writing of the prophets is poetry. All primitive religions, I'm told, I read this elsewhere, obviously, I'm no expert. Poetry and religion were the same thing. Beautiful words, beautiful language that seduces you and puts you in a state of amazement and wonder and awe and mystery is the only language worthy of religion. As soon as you get into pedestrian language, like I'm using now, frankly, to teach this to you, it makes it pedestrian. It takes all the wonder out of it. The prophets were much smarter than that. They talked in beautiful, shocking, poetic images, especially second Isaiah, who we assume more and more was a woman, because most of her metaphors, chapters 40 to 55 of Isaiah, are all metaphors of mothers and women. Only a woman could have written them. So we do have a few women prophets even snuck into Israel, which was a very patriarchal religion. So apart from this being grounded in being, and finding that ground again every day, I don't think you can be a prophet. I think you be an ideologue, a leftist ideologue with a whole bunch of opinions. The prophet knows God. And one thing you're even going to see, many of the prophets, it almost surprises us, they feel sorry for God. They're always pleading God's case. Oh, be nicer to God. He's treating you so well, and you're not treating him nice back. Abraham Heschel calls it the pathos of the prophets. They have this sympathy for God, which shows they're in some deep communal relationship. Did you ever read the diary of Etty Hillesum, that Jewish woman who was killed in one of the death camps? If you want to read a life-changing book, read it. She also felt sorry for God. I don't know where the Jews get this, but Etty Hillesum, what's the type? An Interrupted Life. An Interrupted Life. I just thought of it now. Read it. The book could change your life. It's never became real popular. It's just too far beyond most people. But here she is, being starved and imprisoned, and no reason to be happy, no reason to be filled with hope. But she's got this unexplainable hope. Sort of like Anne Frank. Anne Frank became more known. For some reason, Etty was too profound for most people to hear, but it's that same Jewish hope, that same Jewish optimism. So let me say it finally this way, that the prophet, the reason they can speak so clearly and so strongly in the now is because they judge the now from, of all places, the future. They have seen the future. In other words, they have seen where God is leading humanity. They have seen the heart of God. They have drawn close to the heart of God, and they know it's good. And they know the conclusion, do you understand? And therefore, because that is what we're heading toward, they get so impatient and angry at the present. Can you follow that logic? Huh? if you know where it's going, what it could be, what it should be, what God is leading us toward, it's just like, why are we wasting time with all this violence and all this stupidity and all this silliness? They judge the present by the perspective of the future. So maybe that's how we got into this thing of saying they foretold the future. They were the original futurists. Now, our fancy word for that is eschatology. You've probably read that in some theology. They live out of this futuristic vision of where God is leading history, God's dream for humanity, where it's all heading. They become so infatuated with that ideal final goal and vision that they become passionately sad and angry about what we're doing now. Follow me? If you just hold on to that, you're going to have one of the most important keys for understanding the prophets. But again, without living inside of the eternal now, which is God, where 1,000 years are like 1 second, time and space, as even Einstein said, wouldn't mean anything in terms of God. Once you fall into that universal consciousness, once you collapse into that universal being that God is, the present is so dissatisfying. It's so disappointing. You just wonder how people can be satisfied with so little. How they can be content with such a tawdry or puny life. Let me end by sharing with you, because it might draw it together for those of you who think spatially or geometrically. Mircea Eliade's, I think, important distinction between sacred space and profane space. He says, and I so agree with him, all transformation takes place inside of sacred space. He says modern, postmodern people now have a very uneasy and rare access to sacred space. We live, since the Enlightenment, almost entirely in profane space. So just picture a circle, and inside of the circle of sacred space, there is one reference point. There is one center point, and everything bounces off of that. Now, I want you to think, so this doesn't become theoretical. You've all been in sacred space. You wouldn't have come to this weekend if you haven't been. Whenever something jolts you into the absolute now, like the moment you got the call your mother had just died, or your father had just died. That's sacred space. Sometimes it lasts for days or weeks, where everything is experienced in terms of that one reference point. You can't think of anything. Some of you heard me tell the story how I went down to Kmart after I heard my mother died, and opened the front door of Kmart and really wanted to narcissistically shout to everybody in the store, "Why are you just going ahead with your business? Don't you know my mother died?" I mean, you're that caught up in this different shaped universe. I really couldn't believe why anybody else would just be buying and selling at Kmart. Mom just died, don't you know? The world has been rearranged. When you're frightened to death, anything that pulls you to the total now, maybe you only experience it for a second. I don't experience it a lot in worship services. I got to be honest with you, where I most experienced it as a Catholic was in the old charismatic days in the 70s, when you'd have a whole group of Catholic charismatics praising Jesus, and there was no doubt Jesus was the center of that room. And everything was concentrating on connecting with Him, knowing Him, loving Him, serving Him. Evangelicals, I do think, tend to create sacred space much better than most of your mainline churches. Remember the old 40 hours devotion? I used to have to get up as an altar boy, ride my bike to the church at 3 in the morning, and we'd have to kneel there because there had to be someone there for all 40 hours. And I remember being the only one in the church at 3 o'clock at night, all the candles lit, and the one host. Whew, that was sacred space. The whole world was asleep, as it were. It was just me and Jesus. I mean, that's where a lot of this began to happen. Wow. Now, compare that to profane space, where we live almost all of our lives, where the mind keeps you, by the way, which is why the mind has to be dealt with. Picture another circle, but now inside of this circle, picture a whole bunch of dots, irregularly placed all over the circle. And picture your mind or your heart or your fascination just bouncing like a pinball. And you know that's what your mind is like. Mine is, almost all minds are. They just keep bouncing around, thinking thoughts. Eckhart Tolle has taught some of us that 90% of human thought is repetitive and useless. And that people tend to be thinking in their 50s and 60s with the same neural groove patterns of thinking that they were thinking as a teenager. It's just the same thing over and over and over again. There's no evidence that mental thought patterns are ever going to lead you to sacred space. More thinking won't make it so. Each time when I come back from a hermitage, I normally have no attraction to reading a book. It lasts for about 2 to 4 months. No desire to read a book. And I've always wanted to read books. So I love books. I love ideas, as you know. But not after I go to the hermitage. Because when I've totally fasted from books for a month or 6 weeks and just lived in the Bible of being and nature and what is and living moment by moment, you know without any doubt that anything in any book, I don't care who it is, will be a letdown. Anything will be a disappointment. Nothing could be as good. And I know that every time. I know it'll happen again next year. And yet, after about 4 months, I get back into profane space, and it's just more ideas and more words and more books. And it's okay. But here's the problem, is most people don't even know there is sacred space. Right? Profane space, like the false self, is not bad. It's only bad when you live your whole life inside of profane space. Now, the secret of the prophets is they had an experience, a transforming experience of sacred space. And we're going to read several of those. I don't think I'll have time now tonight. But the call of Jeremiah, the call of Isaiah, the call of Ezekiel, each one of them is a very clear description of a transformative moment of sacred space, where their world is reconfigured, life is reconfigured, and then henceforward they have to go back in to what looks ordinary, but now has become entirely extraordinary for them, because they see it with a different set of eyes. So I just want to end by saying I think the reason we need a place like the CAC or a School for Prophets is because we've got to find a way to honor this search for God, to send people on this serious search for God, and that is primary. And from that, develop critical consciousness. And those sound like two ends of the spectrum, doesn't it? Sounds like the conservative right and the liberal left. And that's, I think, why there's probably so few of us. I don't think what we're saying will ever fill stadiums. I don't think it will ever be a grand agenda for a large amount of people. But I hope your willingness to come to our internship, come to our center, and even come to this weekend is an invitation, first of all, to deepen that communion, that experience of universal being, of universal connectedness that God is. And then from there, it's your call. I don't know how God is going to use you, but I do think the gift can be educated. I do believe the gift can be called forth. I do believe once we start speaking about the gift and naming the gift like I'm going to try to do this weekend, I think a lot more Christians are going to recognize, I might just have that gift now and then. I don't need to name myself a prophet. I don't need anybody else to call me a prophet. But I can now and then operate prophetically. At the same time being radically committed to the big picture, the great tradition, while able to absolutely critique it. So let's end on that for tonight, and we'll spend the next couple days trying to unpackage it. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Okay, we'll try to go a little further this morning. I've given you a handout. I'll be reading it in great part also, just so we'll have it recorded. But I'd like to give us the overview of the whole prophetic period and tradition and the individuals involved. So when we use individual quotes, you can have some hook to hang them on, some kind of context. As you see, I divide the prophets into three categories: those who spoke and never gave us any writings, which is the earlier prophets, where the prophetic tradition is just unfolding. Then probably the more known ones are the prophetic writers, beginning with Amos, who actually put down their thoughts, and these became the books, the prophetic books of the Hebrew Scriptures. And finally, what we call the prophetic narratives, Lamentations, Jonah, and Daniel. Now, of course, before the recent period, people thought of Jonah and Daniel as real historic figures. We're pretty sure they were not. They were created archetypal figures who other writers used to communicate a prophetic or apocalyptic message. Those who are capitalized there are called the major prophets. Isaiah, who again, before modern scholarship, we thought was one person. Now we have three Isaiahs in three different periods. Clearly, the first Isaiah was such a monumental figure in Judaism that two later people, to give their writings credibility, of course, called themselves Isaiah, and they were all put together. Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Daniel was thought to be a major prophet. Now we don't even think he was a historical person, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a message there. Although it's really more apocalyptic than prophetic. Now hold on to that distinction. We'll try to clarify that later. But let's look at it quickly, and let's start, of course, with the one whom everything starts with in Judaism, Moses. And Moses puts all of it together. That's what it means to be a patriarch, or in masculine spirituality we speak of the king, who holds together the warrior, the magician, the lover, all the archetypes into one very whole person. To found something, to hold something together in unity, you almost have to yourself represent the different parts, or honor the different parts. And we'll see that Moses is a prophet, is a lover, is a warrior, and certainly is a king in those archetypal senses. But he calls himself a prophet, and one of the most key passages in unpackaging the beginnings of this whole tradition is in Deuteronomy 18. I'm going to read this one at a little length because it so illustrates how it starts, and how Moses, who's led this people now, they're just becoming a people out of slavery into freedom, which is the archetypal movement for every human psyche. He describes how he's going to hold them together and how he's going to keep them free. And in general, let's use that as our simple understanding of a prophet. It's one who keeps God free for people, which is a very hard thing to do, because the priestly class is always making God inaccessible. You can only come to God through us, by doing the rituals right, by doing the morality right. That's the meaning of John the Baptist. I'm going to lower the mountains and pull up the valleys. I'm going to make a straight way to God. It is very hard to keep God free. You understand how I'm saying that? It's very hard. Because what institutions do is always trap God. So God isn't that accessible, isn't that available. Always the little doorways are made very narrow and very exacting. And on the other side, not only is the prophet's job to keep God free for humanity, but to keep you free for God. Now that is a monumental task, to do both of those. To keep both free for one another, so the encounter can happen, so the relationship can happen. And that's why they're going to spend so much time destroying false idols of legalistic religion, ritualistic religion. It's amazing that we've ever gotten back into so-called temple worship. Because you're going to see, if there's one thing they harangue, it's the preoccupation with church services. And to this day, that's what most churches are about, is conducting church services. The prophets have little use for church services. Even though they don't throw them out, they just say, that's not where it's at. You're going to read Jeremiah, the temple, the temple, the temple. He says, dang it, forget about the temple. That isn't where it's at. Temple sacrifice. But anyway, back to Deuteronomy 18. And this is supposedly Moses speaking. When you come into the land that Yahweh your God has given you, you must not fall into the habit of imitating the detestable practices of the natives. So again, this is defining the self as special, apart, giving you a sense of dignity, significance, chosenness, which is where you got to start. There must never be anyone among you who makes his son or daughter pass through fire, who practices divination, who is soothsayer, augur, or sorcerer, who uses charms, consults ghosts or spirits, or calls up the dead, which is what I guess all the native peoples would have done. The person who does these things is detestable to Yahweh your God. It is because of these detestable practices that Yahweh is driving these nations before you. So here we're still going to have a very clear distinction, as primitive religion always does, or immature religion, between the good guys and the bad guys. And that's the way you start. And of course, we're always the good guys. And the other ones are the bad guys. So they're able to promote what they call the ban. When they enter a city, they kill everybody in sight, including their animals, and burn their houses. And you all say, wow. As a lot of people did. This is why Catholics used to not read the Bible. It just didn't seem very inspiring. We'd say, what does this have to do with God? Well, to be honest, probably very little. They're just beginning to hear God. God is just breaking through enough to give them beloved status. That's like a fundamentalist, the first night after the conversion experience. They know they're beloved. They're so inflated with that experience. They're so exalted by that experience, which is what religious experience does to you. It really explodes your ego. There's nothing like being told you're God's special one, but that's where you got to start. And if you don't stay on the journey, if you just stop right there, religion actually becomes toxic, even though it's necessary. Do you see why the staging of this thing is so important? That it's a journey, and that's the primary metaphor. The journey of this people. Now Moses is just getting them started on the journey. He's still telling them to oppose these soothsayers and so forth. But interestingly enough, he's going to now appoint his own form of what I'm going to call non-rational teachers. So if the priestly class, the scribes and the lawyers and the temple setup symbolize more structured, rational religion, what you'll always find on the side is established the doorway to the non-rational. And unless you understand that, you can't appreciate the prophets. And I'm convinced that's one reason the prophets fell into disfavor in the West. We certainly since the Enlightenment, but already beginning in the high scholastic period, Western Christianity has had little appreciation for the power and the importance and the centrality of integrating the non-rational. Now, let me right now distinguish the non-rational from the irrational. They're different. I don't mean irrational, and that's what he's calling these soothsayers. I mean that which is not subject to logic. That doesn't make it irrational. It's more right brain, as we would say. It's more symbolic. It's more intuitive. It's more felt. It's more poetry than prose. So, let's go back to Deuteronomy 18. You must be entirely faithful to Yahweh your God. Everything is in terms of faithfulness to this relationship. These nations whom you are dispossessing, they can listen to their soothsayers and diviners. But this is not the gift that Yahweh is giving to you. Yahweh your God will raise up for you prophets like myself. So he calls himself a prophet. This is a new, now his word would have been navi or seers. Prophets from among yourselves, from your own brothers and sisters, to whom you must listen. So there's no highly structured legal system or it's a theocracy at this point. There is no government. They can't have a king. God is their king. And so who's going to tell us what to do? So he's establishing from the side those whom they must listen to. This is what you yourselves asked of Yahweh your God. You asked for someone to teach us. At Horeb, on the day of the assembly, do not let me hear again, you said, the voice of Yahweh my God, nor look any longer on this great fire, or I shall die. The people said, God is too beyond, too other, too transcendent. He scares us. We want to go between, right? Which is what religion always wants. Carl Jung has said, I think with some degree of truth, that institutional religion was created to make primary religious experience unnecessary. So we really wouldn't have to have primary religious experience. We would have it all done by go-betweens, middlemen. They're called priests, all right? And I'm convinced that authentic religious experience doesn't need a lot of middle management. But people want, and I think this is realistic, by the way. I'm not speaking on one side or the other. I think I couldn't stand here today or sit here today and talk the way I do if I hadn't had years of middle management. You understand? You have to start there to give you the wisdom tradition. You're educated inside of the system, ironically and paradoxically, to have the freedom to critique that very system. That's what gives you the authority to critique it, because you are a part of it. You can't come from outside of anything and critique it. You have to know the rules. You have to know the tradition. You have to know what it really means, and you can only learn that inside. Do you feel the tension already? Do you feel the paradox? It's both and. The only people who can critique Christianity are Christians who've really laid down their life for it. And the same is true of Judaism. But it is a paradox. And yet I see it true in our postmodern society. If you look, and most people who do critique Judeo-Christianity, almost without exception, they critique it by the criteria that Judeo-Christianity taught them. They hardly ever see this, The criteria of truth-telling, faithfulness, honesty, love, compassion. Where did they learn that? They learned that from this tradition, that those were even values. And your typical European or American secular humanist, your journalists who are always lambasting religion, they never take the time to step back and recognize that every single criteria that they're using to lambast religion from, they learned from religion. That's the honesty of the prophet. He knows that. He knows he learned everything from inside, and that insider status has given him the freedom to be a certain kind of outsider. Do you follow me? As I said last night, standing on the edge of the inside. It's like straddling the inside and the outside. It's a rare and difficult position to hold. Back to the text. So they wanted middle men, and I think you normally need them. So what I will do, I will raise up a prophet for them from their own brothers and sisters. He says, Yahweh told him. I will put my words into his mouth, her mouth, and they will tell them all that I command him. So this is the beginning of it. The expectation of this role emerging. The person who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name shall be held answerable to me. Now you may say in your heart, how are we to know what word was spoken by Yahweh and what was not spoken by Yahweh? Which was our idea to this. Well, how do we know if he's a true prophet? Just because you say you're speaking for God. And it's the most disappointing criteria. And this is what Yahweh says back to Moses. When a prophet speaks in my name, and the thing does not happen, and the word is not fulfilled, then he was not a true prophet. It feels like, well, that's a tautology. That isn't helpful at all. That's about the best we're ever going to do, right at the beginning. It says, if it happens, he or she was a true prophet. If it doesn't, they weren't, So you're supposed to live now in that helplessness. In other words, the prophet has no credentials, no certification, no licensing, no verification. That's why we created ordination later, by the way. Which I do believe is a social construct, because people had an absolute need for verification, for licensing. Do you want to follow me? Some degree of validation that we should listen to this person. So we created seminaries and ceremonies to validate people that we call ordination. Probably had to happen. As you see, it starts right at the beginning. Give us some middlemen. And human nature needs that. But the prophet is precisely a middleman, or middlewoman, as we're going to see in a moment, who by definition has no institutional validation. Do you see what a dangerous posture that is? Why it fell into disfavor. Why it's always in conflict with the institution. Because once you seek verification, validation that what I say is the Word of God and it will happen, like we priests seem to enjoy, you're by definition not a prophet anymore. You have to live in that anxiety. I can't prove it. I just say it. And those of you who are pure of heart and ready to hear and share in that level of consciousness and spiritual readiness, you'll know it. You'll know when the Word of God is the Word of God. It's like I've told many of crowds over the years, the best compliment I ever get is when people say that what I told them they already knew, but they never knew it until I told them. That's true of all universal great spiritual wisdom. It's already God in you, and it's all one consciousness. It's all one truth. And like Socrates, you're the midwife, and all you do is call it forth, and the two knowings meet. Do you see? You know it already. In fact, if there isn't that intuition of recognition, and I love to play on the English word, to recognize, recognize is to know again. to know again. Because you know it at some intuitive, primitive level already. If there isn't that sense, even though you might not like it, I doubt it that it's spiritual wisdom. Spiritual wisdom just rings true at a deep gut level. As yes, yes. Even though I don't like it, I don't want it to be true, damn it, that is true. And that's the way the prophet speaks to the people, those who are ready, those who are connected at that level, aligned at that level of communion and consciousness, they immediately know it's true. And other people who haven't done their spiritual homework, who haven't gone to the level of communion and unitive consciousness, it'll go, and I know this is a preacher, it goes right over their heads. I'll just see this quizzical look on some people's eyes, like, what is he talking about? And it doesn't mean they're bad people, they're just early on the journey, And I sound like someone from another planet. It just doesn't fit if you're still inside of quid pro quo thinking, dualistic thinking. You got to merit it. You got to manipulate God. If you've lived that, which almost all civil religion is at that level, the manipulation of God, not the freeing of God, you move into free God and free people, and they don't know what you're talking about. In fact, they see you as dangerous, and they will normally fight you. They will call you a heretic, a sinner. They'll report you to the bishop. They'll everything, because you understand, if you're inside of strict quid pro quo worldviews, which looks like, keeping the law, obeying commandments, everybody doing what they're told to do, and you have someone speaking outside of that context, where that isn't even the framework, that isn't even the question, that isn't even the issue, you look almost always dangerous. Now that is why Jesus says, it doesn't record it in the Hebrew Scriptures, a few are recorded, but Jesus says you killed all of the prophets. And you killed John the Baptist. And that's why he goes into hiding after his cousin John the Baptist is killed. He sees the pattern. He knows its inevitability. They've killed everyone who speaks from this perspective, and after that he knows they're going to kill him. Because Jesus has no doubt he's a prophet. But anyway, I put Moses there at the top of the list, and notice he's between the speakers and the writers. Now the tradition called these first 5 books the Torah, the books of Moses. We doubt whether Moses literally wrote them, but who knows, maybe he did. So we put him in between. Then the first one that clearly emerges on the scene, although it's a very primitive account in Judges, is, I think not ironically, a woman, Deborah. She's called a prophetess. Actually, what she seems to prophesy is more about killing and violence. But at least it's a start, It's still this protecting of our identity and our boundaries. That's where you start. It's all about your group over against other groups. That's where human consciousness begins. Then we have Samuel, who anoints David. We have Nathan, who confronts David. And that example of the confrontation between Nathan and David is the only clear example in all the Hebrew Scriptures where the two roles of king and prophet ever coincide and ever come together. The rest of the history, they are going to be fighting one another all the time. The king symbolizing establishment, law, structure, order. The prophet symbolizing the non-rational, the oppositional, the critique of the kingly tradition. But this is what makes David the Jewish whole man or holy man. Again, putting together all king, warrior, lover. But the one he lacked was magician. Now let me say a little, I know that word isn't one you usually use. It's been popularized by male spirituality. But of all the male archetypes, the one that is the most varied and complex is the magus, or the magician. The highest form of the magician is the prophet. And it moves all the way through the liturgist, the ritualist, the counselor, the advisor, the wise man, the teacher, the clown, the trickster, the political cartoonist. Those are all different forms, if you will, of the magus. The introducing of wisdom into culture, in rational and non-rational forms. It really hasn't been very appreciated in the West. Although we have it beautifully illustrated in the story of the birth of Jesus, where we have the Magi. I always say they're New Agers from San Francisco, which are most unlikely people to be introduced into a Jewish story. It's meant to be a subversive text. That we have shepherds who were institutionalized sinners, who did not go to the temple, did not obey the law or pay their tithes. And we've sentimentalized that too, in all the pretty little shepherd stories at Christmas. It's not the point of the text at all. And the second group that honors or recognizes the Christ are not Jewish people who've gone to the temple at all. The people outside the system, the appreciation of the non-rational, people who see God in nature and the stars. By the way, I should have pointed out, in speaking of Moses, that his primary religious experience is a nature experience. It's the burning bush. Has nothing to do with temple, has nothing to do with priesthood, has nothing to do with law, morality. In fact, he's a murderer, running from the law, watching his father-in-law's sheep. And we're going to have that keep recurring, but it gets more and more localized inside of temple worship, inside of defined sacred space. Do you see? Anyway, we have Nathan now representing that non-rational tradition of the prophet, confronting David, who is the rational, organized, patriarchal king of the people at that point. And normally, when the prophet enters the court and points the accusing finger at the king says, "Off with your head," But what makes David most amazing is that he says, "Nathan, you're right. I am a murderer. I am an adulterer. I have sinned." And he moves into repentance publicly. Never happens again. It's only the one time. And so psychologically we would say, of course, the acceptance of Nathan, the magician, becomes the fourth gift that makes David not just a king, not just a warrior who killed the 10,000s, not just a lover who played the harp and wrote the psalms and made love to women, but he's also finally the magician himself by integrating, accepting the magician or the prophet Nathan. But I just gave that little excursus because I'm going to return back to it several times. I want you to see the prophet under the umbrella of the magician or the non-rational speaker. Then we have a couple centuries later Elijah, who becomes the archetypal prophet. They're always waiting for his return. That's why you hear that, expected of Jesus. Is this Elijah come back? Elijah and Moses are both, we would say, beautiful symbols of integration of action and contemplation. We have Elijah alone in the cave, hearing God's voice through the quiet little breeze, not through the fire, not through the earthquake, not through anything dramatic, but through the gentle breeze. We have Moses encountering God in the burning bush, both nature-based. And immediately after the burning bush, the first words Moses hears is from that same burning bush, Yahweh saying, "My people are groaning in Egypt. They are oppressed by the Pharaoh. You are to go to the Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go." And I've always said there at the very beginning, 1200 BC approximately, we have the integration of religious experience and political action. And what you're going to have, the whole rest of this tradition, this whole lineup, is the prophets are always trying to put it back together. authentic religion and immediate economic, social, political implications. That they're the teachers of justice. They have no patience with people running to the temple, offering their sacrifices, who are not just in the outer world. And so they rail against charging too much and taking advantage of the poor. You can see why we conveniently forgot the prophets, because we still live in this kind of dualistic religion, which is all about the temple, the church building, and very seldom drives people to confront the Pharaoh and to tell him to let my people go. Elijah will do the same thing in confronting the king Ahaz and the false prophets of Baal. So right at the beginning, Moses and Elijah, beautiful integration symbols of what we call action and contemplation. Elisha becomes the successor of Elijah, which already tells us what I think legitimates in a little symbolic way what we're trying to do here. Elijah puts his mantle on Elisha. It seems to indicate that the prophetic role can be taught, can be passed on. That Elijah, as it were, is the mentor of prophecy to Elisha. Then, in the 8th century, we have the emergence of the first of the writing prophets, Amos. Now, as I mentioned to you last night, he was a arborist, I guess we'd call him today, one who took care of trees. Was not an educated man, was not a system man, and while he's taking care of his sycamore trees, God calls him to go and to confront the sacred city of Bethel, which was, like a sort of Lourdes of its day. It was where all the people came for miracles and healings and high priestly class, and so it was a sacred shrine city. And he's supposed to go to Bethel, we would usually say, and tell them that God is not enjoying all of this, all of these shrines and candles, and if this sounds like anything you might know. I like candles too, please. Hear me right when I say those things. I'm going to make my little digs, but because the prophets did it. But I don't think they say it's wrong to light the candles, but just make the connection. And don't make the candles and the lighting of the candles at the shrine of Bethel an end in itself, that this turns God on, to have candles lit and bullocks and heifers sacrificed, which was the ritual in Jerusalem. Thus says the Lord, for these transgressions of Israel. Now remember, Israel is the northern kingdom, Judah is the southern kingdom. Bethel is in the northern kingdom, Amos is prophesying up there. I will not keep God from punishing you, because you sell honest people for money. You sell the needy for a pair of shoes. You trample on the heads of the poor. You prevent the humble from getting justice. The priestly class in Bethel had become quite comfortable from all these liturgical tourists, who came and put their little monies at the shrine. You prevent the humble from getting justice. You lay yourselves down before the altar upon clothes that were taken from the poor. And in the house of God, the priests drink the wine of those that have given their money. It's a clear critique of religion for the sake of religion. Now his great and beautiful metaphor is justice shall flow like a running stream. That was one of the favorite lines of the black people of America, why it's written on the tomb of Martin Luther King, and why so many black people were named Amos. They got this guy, They understood him because, again, people who are oppressed, people at the bottom, so often can understand. People at the top have no use for Amos. You'll never find a white establishment man named Amos, all right? We would have no need for such kind of flowing justice. Then, again, they don't get the point. Further on, he says, I, speaking for God. Very often, the prophet will speak in the first person. He is so sure that he is a voice piece for God that he will talk in the first person. I, and I means God. I hate, I despise your feasts. I take no pleasure in your festal gatherings. Even though you offer me burnt offerings, grain offerings, I will not accept them. The thank offerings of your fatted beasts, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your lyres, I will not listen. In another place, he says, I'm plugging my ears while you sing. You know, all your pretty songs, they don't make me happy. You think how much of church service is singing songs, you know? As if this just turns God on. God just loves songs, you know, polyphony and Gregorian chant. Remember, all of that isn't doing anything for God. It's doing, beautifully, I hope, something for us. If it's taking you to sacred space, if it's transforming your psyche into a mysterious, bigger world, okay, it's all good stuff. But if it's religious polyphony, for the sake of religious polyphony, where it's not really saying, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, but Kyrie eleison in 5-part harmony, which is lovely music, I'm all for it, you know. But is it working its work anymore? Huh? Is it really leading to the Lord have mercy experience? Now after Amos, soon after Amos, maybe they were contemporaries perhaps, we have Osee, or Hosea. He's really one of my favorites because he becomes an example of where God uses the very lifestyle of the person. And I think this is true of all of us. It's certainly true of me, I think. God uses the things you've gone through, the things you've experienced and you've struggled with to become the foundation of your message. How can any of us learn except through our own experience? And he encourages, of all things, Osee seems to be asking God, like many young men do, who should I marry? And God tells him, of all things, to marry this prostitute, that I guess he's had relationships with or been attracted to. We don't know. Her name is Gomer. Doesn't sound very romantic, does it? He tells Osee to go marry Gomer. Maybe to save her from her prostitution. We don't know, you know. And he says, be faithful to her at all costs. And so presumably Osee and Gomer lived together for many happy years, I guess, are not so happy because the impression we get is Gomer never really gives up her ways of prostitution. So she is consistently unfaithful to Osee, or Hosea. And God, you just keep being faithful to her, no matter how long or how many times she is unfaithful to you. And then one day, in the middle of that, he tells Hosea, okay, now what you understand down here in your belly, what it's like to be betrayed, to be rejected, not to be loved, that's how God feels. I mean, that's magnificent. That's how God feels. This is what I meant about they feel sorry for God. And he gets them into this relationship where they have empathy, sympathy, sadness for God. And so much when we read the text outside of that context and we hear it simply, it sounds like just railing and screaming at people, and they look like just angry, resentful folks. Unless you understand, and I think it was true of several of them, they aren't very attractive figures at all. You know, like I say, the text is always edging forward, 3 steps forward, 2 steps backward. Some of the prophets clearly feel 2 steps backward. There's no love in it. But another little excursus based on Osee. What they're trying to do, now I'm going to use my language because I've learned it again in our male initiation rites. I found out that every part of every male initiation rite I studied in different cultures, an essential core of it is what we would call grief work. that the male has to be taught how to feel, how to suffer, and even, if you will, how to cry. And if he can't cry over the pain of things, over the sadness of things, he will be a beast. He will be brutal. He will be useless spiritually. The grief mode, which I'm convinced is much that the prophets are teaching. The grief mode, brothers and sisters, is different than the fixing mode. I want you to try to feel the difference. Have you ever just sat on the edge of your bed just weeping, just crying? It's a sense of helplessness, a sense of powerlessness, a sense of communion with the terrible mystery of human sadness and separation. And you just sort of sit there. It's inherently a sense of being caught up in something. Not just your own sadness, but it's always a bigger sadness. The human tragedy, the human impossibility, call it what you want. The human state, which seems so unjust, so wrong, so ridiculous, so impossible. You've tried your best, and damn it, it still doesn't work. But the grief mode is beyond the damn it, which is just anger. And you move beyond the anger where I can't be angry any longer. The reason we found out that men have to be taught the grief mode is that, at least in men, although I'm sure it's true in women too, to a lesser degree, but at least in men, much that passes for anger is really sadness. And men themselves don't know that. How many angry men don't you know? So many men by the second half of life are basically nonstop anger, just coming out in all kinds of stupid directions, or the violence we see in our world today. When spiritually you can be taught that much of your anger is really sadness, it softens the whole thing. It opens up the whole thing. It deepens the whole thing. I'm convinced much of the teaching of the prophets is leading people to exactly that experience. Leading them to grieve over how stupid we've been. How could we do this? How could we be so wrong? How could we make so many mistakes? So he moves into the grief mode himself, the sadness mode. And that sort of breaks what Brueggemann calls our numbness. Numbness is when you refuse to grieve. When you refuse to feel it. You steel yourself. You harden yourself. I think this is most people we know. You can see that hard look on their face. I can't feel it. I'm not going to let myself feel it. When men break down, remember that movie or that novel, Prince of Tides? And when the man finally feels the pain of the first 40 years of his life, going back to his childhood or whatever, he just wants to weep for 3 days. I think maybe if all of us could weep for 3 days, that would be the opening point for God. It's a magnificent and so simple understanding of religious transformation and how God gets in and how we get out. If we had, brothers and sisters, institutionalized in our temples, in our churches, weeping ceremonies after, let's say, the Gulf War, or after September 11th, how much more healing that would have been. Institutionalized grieving, public weeping, instead of marching through Washington with the returning troops from the Gulf War and waving American flags. What does that mean, spiritually speaking? Nothing. Nothing. It maintains the dualism. It maintains the split of the good guys and the bad guys. The best a Christian response could be to any evil, to any sadness, is weeping. Even over a year after September 11th, in most polite circles in America, you cannot ask, was there anything for us to learn from September 11th? did we learn anything? Or immediately was, how can we fix it? Do you understand? How can we change it? How can we make ourselves secure again? You move right back into the controlling mode, the fixing mode, instead of staying there in that sacred space. And you remember, for a few weeks, almost a month or so, after September 11th, we were in sacred space as a culture. It was an amazing time. I don't know that I've ever seen it in my lifetime. For some people, it lasted 2 and 3 months, where everything was seen through one lens. Remember what I said last night about sacred space? Whenever only one thing matters, you're in sacred space. One thing. And for a while, one thing was the lens. And during that time, all kind of people had insight. The nation as a whole didn't, because we didn't have any spiritual leadership. We didn't have any prophets speaking at the bigger level. Even very moderate Americans, even people who'd gone through the internship. I got some letters, were just amazed that I wasn't jumping in line behind George Bush. For a few months, they lost it too. Do you understand? So sacred space can move you either way. It can create a new idolatry, a new securing of America, or a new freedom from the illusion of America. So anyway, I just want to say that bit about everything we're going to study about the prophets. A lot has to do with grieving as that which breaks the paralysis, which breaks the idolatry, which collapses you into a universal sadness, a universal pain. Again, remember, the grieving mode, it's a different stance. The grieving mode is a different mode than the fixing mode. Just hold on to that. And it doesn't have to do with the rational, it has to do with the non-rational. What could I best maybe read from O.C.? I think what you're going to see in O.C. is this sense of dearness or tenderness or sweetness. He's obviously learned this inside of this relationship with Gomer. He's called the prophet of Hesed, or steadfast love. Probably our translation of that would be unconditional love. I will heal your backsliding. I will love you freely. My anger has turned away from you. I will be as the dew to Israel in the morning. You will blossom like a lily. I will bring you into the wilderness, and there I will tenderly seduce you. Now remember, the wilderness is the archetypal image of the primal honeymoon, when God and Israel had something going, when they were really in love with one another. So what the prophet very often does is invite them back to the desert, back to the wilderness, and there alone can they understand. It's like returning to your first love, returning to that first religious experience. So O.C.'s always trying to get them to re-experience the first experience. There I will seduce you in the desert. I will speak lovingly to your heart. You will respond to me there, as in the days of your youth, when I led you out of the land of Egypt. I will lead you with leading strings of love, he says. It's very, very feminine imagery very often. You almost see that he learned it in relationship with Gomer, this woman who apparently he really did love, and she really did love him too. She just didn't know how to be faithful to him. But that had to happen. It becomes a wonderful image of how God uses everything. They're not into this moralistic, oh, Gomer's going to hell because she's a prostitute. Stop it, God even uses her prostitution for good purposes. God uses everything in the prophet's mind. There's no dead ends. So he's easy to like. Many of his passages have been put to music. Then we have soon after emerging the great Isaiah, which is chapters 1 to 39. He's a well-educated establishment figure. And interestingly enough, he has his religious experience inside the temple, which again is the integration place. Now it isn't outside. He's a prophet, but he still respects the tradition. I'm going to read this passage of the religious experience of Isaiah from this translation that I've been pushing in the last few years by Eugene Peterson. I don't know how many of you have discovered it. It's called The Message. I'm sure real scholars, and I'm not one, would probably say, oh, this is more a paraphrasing than a clear translation. But I just find Eugene Peterson, I think he lives in Seattle or somewhere in Vancouver. Yeah. I just find that he's a genius in terms of really getting to the meaning of the text. Let me read Isaiah's first experience in the temple. It's in the 6th chapter. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw him sitting on a throne, high, exalted, and the train of his robes filled the temple. Now this is, the imagination at work. Angel seraphs hovered above him, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 their feet, and with 2 they flew. This became the image of the seraph. And they called back and forth to one another. So it's archetypal majesty, archetypal transcendence, archetypal mystery, beyond, beyond, beyond. So it's not a chummy God, it's a beyond God. Huh? And here's where we get the phrase that we call the holy, 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 that we recite in the Eucharistic prayer. Holy, holy, holy is this God of the angel armies. His bright glory fills the whole earth. Now, you could just pass over that phrase, the whole earth, as another bit of religious poetry. Well, what first Isaiah is going to become is the first prophet of universalism. What he comes to, your first religious encounter becomes pivotal, as we see in Paul and other people. How you encounter God becomes your cosmology and your worldview. This transcendent, mysterious God that Isaiah experiences is clearly now beyond a tribal God. This is a great advance. Almost all we've had in history up to this point are tribal gods. The God of our people, our race, our nation. If we're agrarian, our God is agrarian. If we're nomadic, our God is nomadic. If we're Jewish, God is Jewish too. If we're Catholic, God just happens to be a Roman Catholic, which is very nice, If you're Swiss, God happens to be a banker. If you're German, God happens to be a policeman. It's if you're American, God happens to be a salesman. I mean, we've mass-produced entrepreneurial religion. It's all about selling. Because America is a salesman culture. It sells everything. That's all we understand, is salesmanship. Do you see? And so we sell God. Listen to TV, as if God needs all these people to be cheerleaders and pep rally for God. Why would God need that? He even want it. He must plug his ears, say, what good is this? But his bright glory fills the whole earth. That word is pivotal. This is a God bigger than Israel. And so he's going to come back and critique his own religion and his own people and say, this is simply so that you can get the message and preach it to all peoples, that the chosenness you've experienced is in fact so you can preach chosenness to everybody else too. Do you follow it? It's not just so you can say, oh, we're chosen and you're not. No, God had to have some people to experience election so that they would be in an emotional place, an experiential place, to know what election feels like, to know what beloved status feels like, so you can go beyond and tell the Samaritans, and the pagans and the Magi, you know what? You're elected too. Now they're going to fight him on that, and like they do to this day. I mean, I go to most Christian groups, and who want to say, unless you believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, you are not saved, all this stuff. And say, the Lord Jesus Christ is a message to you so that you can tell everybody else they're saved also. I mean, you'll be kicked out of that church with it. You are a dangerous liberal heretic, because we've made it back into a country club. It's a message for us to give us moral superiority over everybody else. Not a message that we can experience so we can communicate that universal truth. They have not experienced anything beyond tribal religion. I would say most religion I've met in my lifetime is civil religion or tribal religion. Almost 90% of it has little to do with the God of all the earth. In fact, they don't want the God of all the earth. They will come back with these petty little quotes, unless you believe on the Lord Jesus, you cannot be saved. Who is the Lord Jesus? You haven't met the Lord Jesus yet, or you'd know he's not into any kind of tribalism. Back to the text. The foundations trembled at the sound of the angel voices, and the whole house was filled with smoke. And I said, I'm as good as dead. So in the presence of otherness, you feel your littleness. In the presence of the absolute, you become relative. This is the destabilizing of the ego that has to happen. In fact, if your ego is not destabilized, if you do not feel your own littleness, I know you haven't had authentic religious experience. If it merely inflates you about how wonderful you are. Every word I've spoken is tainted. And the people I live with, they're in the same position. They use these words that corrupt and desecrate. They use words, in other words, so glibly, as if they understood this mystery. Karl Rahner, the German Jesuit, said, for 50 years we should all stop using the word God, because we don't have a clue what we're talking about. Just stop using the word. Because you don't know what you're talking about. It doesn't mean anything. It's been so prostituted and polluted. He's saying the same thing. And I have just looked God in the face, the King, the God of the angel armies. This is usually translated Lord of hosts, as you know. Then one of the angel seraphs flew to me. So there's the connecting of the transcendent mystery with the individual. The imagery is marvelous, but like all religious symbolism, you can't read it literally. Literalism is the death of religious experience. The only way transcendent experience can be communicated to the human tiny brain is through metaphor. All right? All, and I mean all religious language is metaphor, all right? All religious language is symbol. That's what fundamentalism does not understand. It's the only language that is possibly capable of the task, because there's no language that can point with literal accuracy to this mystery. If your human mouth forms the word, and your human brain forms the concept, it by definition is not God, all right? It's not capable of it. All you're capable, like the Indian man touching the different sides of the elephant, is to say, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this. But it's always just a part. So all religious language is metaphor. That is crucial to understanding. And I promise you, brothers and sisters, that is not watering down the scriptures. It's filling it up with water. Because once you get inside of metaphorical, poetic language, now there's room for the soul and the psyche to grow, to encounter, to develop. There's mystery is not, as the nuns taught me when I was in Catholic school, and asked them what the Trinity meant, and they said, it's something you can't understand, just believe it. And I know that was the best we could do at that time. Mystery is something you can't understand. In fact, mystery is that which is infinitely understandable. Feel the difference? It has 1,000 levels of understanding. And what we've got to do to bring back the prophetic mind and healthy religion is we've got to teach people the nature of mystery, that we're talking about mystery, And there's never a point where you can say, I got it. There is never a point where you can say, I understand, or I know that. Mystery is infinite knowability. But the angel flew from the transcendent mystery. He held a live coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. He touched my mouth with the coal. So the heat of this mystery comes and touches his lips. Look, this coal has touched your lips. Your guilt is gone. Your unworthiness. I'm pulling you inside of the mystery. So the overcoming of the split, and we have this coming together of God and humanity, which is always an experience of the forgiveness of your sin. Gone is your guilt. I'm not unworthy. I'm not the terrible beast I thought I was. And then I heard the voice of the Master, and this is what it said. Whom shall I send to this people? Who will go for us? I spoke up. I'll go. Send me. So Isaiah offers himself. Some of the others are seduced in, like Jeremiah. And he said, go and tell this people. Listen hard, but you aren't going to get it. Look hard, but you still won't catch it. Make this people blockheads with fingers in their ears and blindfolds on their eyes, so they won't see a thing, they won't hear a word, so they won't have a clue about what's going on, and they won't be able to turn around and understand. In other words, I know that sounds sort of confusing, but what he's saying is your first job is to tell the people that they don't know. You first got to humiliate the ego. You first got to defeat the ego. You first got to take away their arrogance and their false self-assurance that we do know God. We call it, as Stephen mentioned last night, we call it beginner's mind. Unless you can lead people back to, as Jesus put it, to the state of a little child who's immediately in touch with being. That's the little cooing we hear over there from Gracie, you know. She's still 7 months old, immediately in touch with being, just coos with delight. Huh? And he's saying that's the level in which you see reality purely and clearly. You don't filter it through your brain yet. You just experience it. Huh? You just live in union with it. Presence cannot be experienced through the mind. I want to repeat that. Presence cannot be experienced through the mind. And we Catholics did everything we could to define real presence. Transubstantiation, and we objectified the mystery. God is there, and I can see why we did it. That's what priesthood has to do, But in fact, the trouble with that was that it limited the presence, and not just assured that God is there, which I would defend to the hilt. But the trouble is, it says God is just there. And once you say God is just there, then you don't think God's over there. And God's over there too. And God's over there too. And God's down there. And God's up there. You can't localize God. Presence cannot be defined. Presence can only be experienced. And in fact, presence is a relationship concept. God is always present. So many of the prayers of the priests are always calling God to be present. Come, Holy Spirit, come down. Come upon this bread and make it into Jesus. Come into this church. God is already here. It's we who are not here. And all religion is to make you present so that real presence can happen. Do you follow me? Presence is relational. You can't. I would defend the Catholic belief in real presence. And belief that the bread and wine knows what it is. It knows it's the body of Christ. And many of you have heard me say this. It's easier for God to convince bread than to convince us. Bread believes it. Wine has no trouble with it. But we just will not believe we're the body of Christ, right? So we have to keep feeding you the real presence till one day you become capable of presence, and then, for the first time, we have real presence. You follow me? It's all about changing you. And that's why we teach contemplative prayer. It's the only thing worth teaching after a while. Because everything is to teach you how to be present. Because once you're present, and once you learn how to be present to anything 100%, anything can do it. Do you know that? Doesn't really need a tabernacle, small forum. Doesn't really need bread or wine. If you can be present totally to this candle, anything can convert you if you don't resist it in the least. If you don't fight it a bit. If you don't resist it by your mental judgments. When you finally let it come to you and you come to it without judgment. And finally you say, why? Why anything? And you see the texture and the color and the beauty and the gift of it. Anything on this earth, anything can convert you if you accept it 100%. And the way you don't accept things is by mental judgments. And I want you to just look at your life. Anything you're encountering, maybe even my talk right now, and I would certainly understand that, but are you resisting me 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%? It really doesn't matter, but the important thing is that you recognize how much you resist things. Because let's say you're resisting me 30%. Because of the way I talk, and that's perfectly understandable. Or the way I look, or my bald head, or something like that. But the point is that how you're resisting me, this is going to be hard to hear, is probably how you deal with everything. And how you're processing this moment, I'll bet, is how you process life an hour from now. And tomorrow when you're driving back home, that's how you'll process everything on the road. You don't accept anything 100%. You fight it, you critique it, you label it, you judge it, you dismiss it. Your numbed psyche doesn't even experience it. Anything you are present to 100%, without resistance, without judgment, without critique, without analysis, without hatred, can convert you. That's the angel coming to us and saying, holy, holy, holy. You get it? Quickly through the rest of the prophets, although we'll be unpackaging them for the rest of the day, we have Micah, who very much recognizes the karma of good and evil. Let me say a word about that. I'm using clearly an Eastern word there, but this is crucial for not resisting the prophets. The prophets are going to normally, as Jesus does, use the language of external punishment, external judgment. You will be punished. You will be destroyed. And the contemporary psyche has immense resistance to that kind of language. God stepping in and spanking us, all right? Probably goes back to our parental upbringing, you know. But I want you to know it is the only way they know how to describe. In earlier centuries, really it's only been the last century, that human consciousness is so developed that we can describe these things interiorly. The language wasn't available to previous centuries. In other words, all punishment is inherent, is interior, is immediate. The Eastern religions would call it karma. I would call it the law of opposites. You do this and you will fall apart. It won't work. It's like telling a 14-year-old boy who's having quick premarital sex, you know, I know you're going to do it, boy, but it isn't going to work. You're never going to love anybody that way. You're going to get hurt. You're going to be judged, punished. You understand? The punishment is really internal. It's what I'd call the law of opposites, or what Eastern religions would call karma. You've got to know in the prophets, they will talk a different language. And they will say, you know, you will be defeated, you will be destroyed, you will be punished. And they usually have, unfortunately, God being the punisher. Might be one of the main reasons we didn't listen to the prophets. But every time you read this, including in Jesus, remember all punishment and reward is interior and immediate. It might take us a while to experience that. You follow me? It's always externalized in prophetic language. You'll certainly see this in Micah. Then we have Zephaniah, who first unpackages the role of the remnant, the little poor ones. The word in Hebrew is the Anawim. It's the beginnings, well, really not the beginnings, because it begins with Israel being the enslaved people. But where it really gets solidified, this understanding that it's the little ones, the preferential option for the poor, as we now call it. They normally get the message, and the people at the top normally resist the message. Nahum, Habakkuk. That's why I'm glad we didn't name our Christian children after prophets. But Habakkuk says an interesting thing, that both the oppressor and the oppressed are evil. You can see why they killed him. He's already into the third way and understanding. Hey, yes, they did a wrong thing in attacking Israel, but Israel, you're just as bad. You do the same thing. You're no better than the people who are oppressing you, and God is oppressing you, so you'll feel what it feels like to be oppressed. You understand? And understand compassion and learn how to grieve and be transformed and live. But he doesn't take sides as the oppressors are the bad people, like we did after September 11th. But he says, what are you supposed to learn from September 11th? What does this say about you, Israel? Huh? And you are a terrorist nation also. No, we're not a terrorist nation, please. You know, the whole rest of the world knows America is a terrorist nation. But Americans can't see it. And anybody who would say that to America will be killed. That's what Habakkuk was saying. And people who love this Bible and kiss it and say that it speaks with absolute authority pay no attention to such teachings as Habakkuk. Habakkuk is another prophet who is a reluctant prophet like Jeremiah. He's running from God, or Jonah, and God picks him up by the hair and takes him and puts him where he wants him. Jeremiah spent the whole hour, which we're drawing to the end of, I guess, on Jeremiah. He is called a reluctant prophet. Like Jonah, he runs from God. He doesn't want the role. He says, you seduced me, God, and I let myself be seduced. These are called the confessions of Jeremiah. It's when a prophet finally becomes a human being. No prophet becomes more personal and autobiographical and subjective. And there's probably no prophet you can identify with more than Jeremiah. Because he hates his role. He runs from God. He's feeling sorry for himself. His call is beautiful. I read this at my own ordination mass because there was a part of me that identified with him even then. Where is it here? Excuse me. He's called. He responds to it with a little bit of resistance even at the beginning, but then he keeps doing it. Then he feels sorry for himself and complains to God and runs from God, and then God calls him back again. The word of Yahweh was addressed to me. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. That initial unitive experience. Before you came to birth, I consecrated you. I have appointed you as a prophet to the nations. And I said, Lord Yahweh, I don't know how to speak. I'm a child. It sounds like Moses. Moses stuttered. Did you know that? He says, I'm a stutterer. How could you possibly choose me? It's always the stutterer who God chooses. And Jeremiah seems to be the same one. But Yahweh replied, do not say I am a child. Go now to those to whom I send you and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to protect you. So he doesn't give him the message yet, it's just the presence. And the important thing is to experience the presence, and out of the presence will come the message. Yahweh put his hand and touched my mouth, and he said to me, there, I am putting my words into your mouth. I am setting you over nations and over kingdoms to tear up and to knock down, to destroy, to overthrow, to build, and to plant. We have in Jeremiah both the positive and negative nature of the message, and you need both. Before you're going to challenge somebody or critique anybody, and you know this even in terms of personal relationships, you got to hug them. You got to love them. You got to earn the right to criticize anybody. You know that with your wives and husbands. Huh? You can't walk in and just lambast them. You got to first of all have earned the right to say that. And that's true of the prophet. You have to love the church before you can critique the church. Until you've paid your dues to any group, to any institution, I don't believe you have the right to come in and tell it it's terrible. The reason I have the right to critique America is because I am an American, and I love America, and this is my homeland. You can't start with the negative position of simply hating it. It has to start out of primary communion. How many more minutes do we have? 2 or 3? Couple, okay. Well, I only got halfway through the list, but at least we're up to the exile. And let me end on this. Now, what Jeremiah does is, first of all, tell the people they got to go into exile. Then once they're there in Babylon, which I would call liminal space or sacred space, there he teaches them how to find God even in exile. And then, believe it or not, they get so at home in exile, like we all do. We're at home in America. We like this consumer culture. He has to give them the courage now to leave Babylon and to go back to Jerusalem. The very place they thought they didn't want to leave. In fact, they're quite comfortable now. They've got homes and real estate in Babylon. They really don't want to go back to Israel. So that is the most difficult job of the prophet. Leading people into liminal space, teaching them how to experience the transcendent when they're displaced and homeless, and then teaching them what their true home is, to leave what has become their false home and to go back to their true home, which is what all conversion is about, becoming who you already were but didn't know it. You follow me? Going back to the beginning, as T.S. Eliot says, and knowing it for the first time. Thank you. I got to stop, I think. The tape is done.